Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I always love to talk about uh, humans in the environment and how we're affecting it and how we can improve the way that we live on the earth and assist with improving water quality. So I need to get my slides to advance. There we go. I wanted to start off with a goal. This is eelgrass. It is a submerged vascular plant, meaning that it's very similar to our land plants in that it has roots and rhizomes that get nutrients from the soil, from the sediment here in the base of this picture. So eelgrass is one of our end goals. We have many end goals. We would love to see eelgrass where eelgrass should be. We'd like to see healthy oyster reefs and seaweed flats. So we do like seaweed or macroalgae, but we like it when it's diverse and at a reasonable amount. So this is our goal. This is what we need. This is what we want. And this is what we get when we have good water quality. Now, that's not to say that fertilizer is all bad. As humans in the environment, we do need fertilizer to grow our food. We use it when we're growing things like houseplants or in our garden. But what we need to do is use fertilizer correctly or responsibly. And that means understanding the right amount of fertilizer to use on our ornamentals and our vegetables so that we're not letting excess fertilizer get into the environment. Because what happens when excess fertilizer leaves our lawn, leaves our agricultural field, leaves our sports and playing fields after we fertilize them, is that we over fertilize our coastal waters. So we go from a place where we have that beautiful eelgrass sitting in a relatively pristine water quality environment to something that looks like this. Still beautiful. In fact, it looks like a little bouquet of seaweed to me in the middle, but there's a lot of seaweed around this eelgrass plant, and it's stressing out that eelgrass plant. We get this bloom when we have excess nutrients in the environment, and fertilizer is one source of those excess nutrients delivered to our coastal waters. So in addition to the green seaweeds in the middle here, we have a couple in the middle. All of this in the background growing around our stalks of eelgrass are also lots of seaweed. So this is what we want to avoid. We want to have the other image. So I want to take a step back in time because our issues with water quality are a result of our population in Long Island Sound, on Long Island, in the East Coast, throughout the nation. In this case, I'm using the population of New York City to illustrate the increase in our population over time, especially in New York and Connecticut. So this is a diagram of the population of New York City from 1756 to 2020. And what we see is a slow progression. So from 1750 to the 1900s or so, we had a relatively slow rise in population. But by 1910, as that image up at the top shows, we started to get the development of New York City and all of our coastal regions of Long Island and the Connecticut coast. So population is increasing. And then in the 1930s, we had an eelgrass die-off in the North Atlantic. That die-off decimated about 95% of the eelgrass population in the North Atlantic, so both along the United States and on the coast of Europe. It was related to a wasting disease, so not solely attributed to nutrients or increase in population, but to a wasting disease. But what happened is that after that disease passes, so eelgrass has its own epidemic, it's killed off. There's some eelgrass still surviving in certain places, but now that eelgrass has to contend with these higher impacts from humans. So in the 1930s, we have the die-off, and there's a slow recovery of eelgrass throughout most of the North Atlantic, but not so much in Long Island Sound, not so much along Long Island in general. And that again is because we were at such a high population that that the eelgrass is struggling with poor water quality in our places like Peconic Estuary, the Great South Bay, and Long Island Sound, New York Harbor. And eelgrass did not fully recover back into those places. In the 1970s, we have what I call the environmental awakening, or what everyone calls the environmental awakening. And in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed. So that really reflects a growing awareness that water quality is an issue that humans are contributing to and are the primary cause of those water quality issues, and that we needed to do something about it. Within Long Island Sound in 1998, Connecticut and New York agreed to reduce the nitrogen load to Long Island Sound by 58.5%. That goal was met in 2017, but in 2017 we said, hey, we've reduced hypoxia, we've improved water quality in places, but we still have issues. We still have further to go. And that's what both states are working on now in terms of looking forward. What's the next step of in our continuing journey to improve water quality in these systems? So again, I want to take a step back. So not so much in time now, but in space, and talk about nitrogen sources on a regional level. When we talk about the sources of nitrogen, we often go back to kind of these two major areas, the Mississippi River Basin, which is really the central portion of our nation, and the northeastern United States, which is quite populated. So in the Mississippi River Basin, about 9% is due to human waste, septic and sewer. About 25% is due to atmospheric deposition, the rain, the nitrogen that we find in rain, dust, and snow. And then the remainder is due to fertilizer, with this darker green area of 42% being fertilizer applied to agricultural fields, and about 24% in that Mississippi River Basin coming from fertilizer applied to turf, to our lawns, to our parks, our golf courses, our recreational fields. So that's the Mississippi River Basin. In the northeastern United States, so this is really our whole northeastern region, we have a different breakdown. We have about 1/3 coming from that septic and sewer human waste sources, about 1/3 from that atmospheric deposition, the nitrogen in rain, dust, and snow, and then the remainder from fertilizer, with a much lower level applied to our agricultural fields of about 16% of that nitrogen source, and about 20% coming from our lawns and parks and recreational fields. So this is a problem, and this is a problem for communicating to our coastal communities, because this is what has been available to us in the past. These are the breakdowns that have been available to us in the past. But when we're looking at coastal communities, we really need to focus in on what the local sources of nitrogen are. And that's where my research has delved into, is trying to understand at a very small scale local level where our nitrogen is coming from, so that we can target our efforts to really get the most bang for our buck, to say, in this watershed, we need to focus on fertilizer. In this watershed, we need to upgrade septic systems. In this watershed, let's manage our stormwater and take care of that atmospheric deposition. So that's what I'm going to share over the next few minutes here, is some of those results. Before I get started, though, I just want to flash this up on the screen and say that the work I'm presenting today comes from a lot of different reports and projects that can be broken down into these three main groups of researchers that have been working on nitrogen in Long Island Sound and New York and Connecticut. The first is NSYNC, which looks at how nitrogen travels through our watersheds, how it traverses from our lawn down to the estuary, to our salt water. The nitrogen loading model, which involved me, partners from Cornell Cooperative Extension, and colleagues here at UConn. So there was a large team involved with this. And we look at the different sources of nitrogen that are being applied to the land, and again, what makes it down to the estuary. And then a new effort, which I'm happy to share some of the early results with you is the residential fertilizer use. And this really focuses in on what homeowners are doing on their lawn and how we can inform our marketing campaigns to get them to reduce the nitrogen in their areas. Now, all of these nitrogen loads are based on how we live on the land. And that's what I wanted to capture in this image here. You know, we have our homes and our recreational fields, our parks, our golf courses. Those are all sources of nitrogen from fertilizer, as are our agricultural lands. In addition to that, we have runoff from our roofs and our paved areas, direct input from storm drains, our wastewater from septic and sewer. So when we're looking at these nitrogen sources, we look at across the landscape and say, what's happening locally, and how does that inform us as to the nitrogen level that these systems are receiving? Now, the work I'm going to present right now was conducted in the embayments of Long Island Sound, but it applies broadly to all of our coastal regions on Long Island and the Connecticut coastline. So these colors that you're seeing are the watersheds or the land that drains to each of these embayments. And there are about, I want to say about 100 embayments shown here. And these are the little bays and harbors that dot our coastlines. So jumping ahead, there's a lot that goes into that, but summing up, about 23% of the nitrogen entering our embayments is coming from those fertilizer sources. Now, just as a reminder, this is different from that northeastern United States, which said about 20% was coming from fertilizer to lawn, but there was an additional 16% coming from agricultural fields. I want to focus briefly on 4 embayments, Darien River in Connecticut, and then Mamaroneck in New York, Hempstead Harbor, and Mattatuck Creek out on Long Island. In these embayments, we see fertilizer as a big source. So this figure here is showing you the total nitrogen load being received by each of these places. The green is the amount or the contribution from fertilizer. What we can see is that Darien, Mamaroneck, and Mattatuck all have pretty large fertilizer inputs in terms of the amount that's coming from them. So that's very different from from this figure, which said, oh, 23% from fertilizer. If we look at these individual ones, Hempstead Harbor probably has about 23% from fertilizer, but these other places are dominated by that fertilizer source. The model further lets us look into the sources of fertilizer in these places. So in Darien River, this red color is telling us that the majority of fertilizer is being applied to lawns. In Mamaroneck, there is the red color indicating lawn application, but there's green, which indicates a golf course source for this watershed, along with parks and recreational fields in this blue area being a big source. We come out to Mattatuck Creek, and it's one of our more agricultural areas, and almost half of the nitrogen is coming from agricultural land in that system. So again, I'm just highlighting that when we're looking at nitrogen as a source, we really want to be able to zoom in and understand what's happening in these systems. So our current project does just that at an even greater scale. I'm showing our results just for Connecticut here. These are the results that we've completed, but this similar approach is going to be applied to Connecticut and to New York along the Long Island Sound coastal area. Right here is the predicted nitrogen load from residential fertilizer application. And we see that there are areas with higher levels, which are the red, and areas that are lower, which are the blue and the green. And so this tells us, you know, for example, Westport has a lot of fertilizer application, whereas this watershed, this town here, has relatively little. And we come over here and there's even much less in this area here. So it helps us understand where fertilizer is being applied and how it's being applied. We have another piece of this model that tells us how leaky areas are. So if you apply fertilizer in any area that's red, we call that being leaky to nitrogen, meaning that that nitrogen is going to make it down to the coast. It'll reach those salt waters. Whereas the areas that are blue, if you apply fertilizer or nitrogen to those sources, the nitrogen isn't going to go very far. We combine those two models together and we get a result that tells us where fertilizer is being applied, coupled with where it's most leaky, so where it's going to run down to the coast. And we can see, yes, there are areas along the coast, in fact, a lot of areas along the coast that are fairly, have a fairly large input from nitrogen fertilizer. But if we go inland, there are also areas that are further inland that are also in that red zone, meaning that if I apply it here, that nitrogen will make its way down to the coast. And that's a challenge. It's easier to get at the people who live on the coast and say, hey, you're impacting the water that is, 200 feet away from your property. But it's a lot harder sell to go up to uh, interior areas of Long Island and Connecticut and say, hey, you're having a big fertilizer impact here on our coastal water quality. But that is what we know to be true. So I'll end on this slide, my final slide. One solution that we can apply, and what we are working towards in this project where we are applying this model, is to inform community-based social marketing campaigns. And the photo shows an image of one campaign that was done at a community in Niantic. But what we try to do is we target those areas where those community-based social marketing campaigns can be most effective, so that we can get people to really work at reducing that fertilizer and improve our coastal water quality. Our results from this effort are going to be coming out in 2025. I've shown you some of the preliminary results here, but I think as the Long Island Water Campaign here moves forward, these tools can help inform your outreach efforts towards reducing nitrogen impacts on Long Island Sound and the South Shore of Long Island. So with that, I will turn it back over to Doug. Thank you.